Well, welcome everyone. And this is a webinar with Aaron Turner tonight for the 3PDK. And 3PDK is a nonprofit organization that is committed to bringing understanding of the three principles to people in Denmark. And so we usually have lots of stuff going on in Danish, but we also about once a month have someone international because it's wonderful to hear different voices. And today we have the pleasure of having Aaron Turner here, who I met the first time in 2012 in Gothenburg with Anders Hagland. Do you remember that?
I do.
It's a long time ago. Aaron.
That is a long time ago. I was actually trying to remember, was that 2012, 2013? I do remember. Wow.
And I wanted to share just one quick thing about that, because I met Michael Neal in June of 2012, so that was my first exposure to the principles, and then you in September. And I remember coming up to you on a break and asking you about ego, because to me, throughout my story of being studying psychology and spirituality, ego was like the bad guy. Ego was like an entity that you had to destroy and kill, or at least silence. And you just said to me, ego is just thought. And it blew me away. I mean, literally, I got such a huge insight that I saw it as the same as as thought, and not this entity. So that was I wanted to thank you for that, because that was huge for me at the time. And I'm really glad that you said yes to coming today. Thank you so much. And such a joy working with you in the Three Principles Global Community on the board there, and
yes,
having fun and doing stuff together. So welcome. I'm gonna be silent now so you can say something about what we agreed on.
Yeah, great. So thank you for inviting me, Natasha, and thanks for sharing that. It's such a cool story. You talk to people and you don't really know what difference it makes. So it's kind of cool to hear. It's really cool to hear. So that's one in the column where, oh, that did something for someone. Whereas those ones where someone says, oh God, what's that? What are you talking about? But so the topic that Natasha and I talked about is talking a little bit about how the three principles differs from other psychological approaches, because partly because that looking at that, like the way the principles differ from other psychological approaches, was how I came to understand the principles originally. It's where my appreciation for just how for the fact of the principles as a new perspective, and eventually my appreciation for the fact that there was a really profound discovery behind them, came from looking in that direction. And also because one of the things I've been kind of appreciating over the last couple of weeks is the role of understanding in our experience, the role that understanding plays in where we're up to. So I know for myself, if I'm struggling or I'm trying to do something, or I don't like the experience I'm in, my first inclination is to do something about it, right? And oftentimes I'll follow that inclination because, hey, I understand the principles. I understand enough to know what to do and what not to do, what to focus on and what not to focus on. So I don't really try to change my circumstances. I get to work on my thinking. Right? And what's fascinating to me, it's kind of like, I don't know when I'll ever properly learn, but it just drags me in deeper. It just drags me in deeper. And it only ever happens because I forget that we're living essentially in the limits and the ripples of our own understanding. We're not really living in the ability of what we can do and what we do and we can't do. Like our relationship to mind, thought, and consciousness, whether we call it that, whether we're aware of it as that, is completely a function of our understanding. And when I remember that, I'm able to appreciate that, and weirdly, things seem to change. And when I forget that and I'm trying to do something about it, things do change, but not in a good way. So I wanted to talk about that because I just don't think we can appreciate that enough. And the last reason I wanted to talk about this topic is because it's impossible to, you know, when we get an insight or when we get an appreciation about something that's true, and you get that feeling where things become simple and understandable, and you feel, you have a feeling of having been enlightened and free and gained some freedom in some way. Well, that's powerful, and we get to appreciate, oh, I saw something, I learned something, I appreciated something. But it's easy to forget how infinite that is, you know, and how there's endless understanding, you know, to be had. And so because of that, I think sometimes when we appreciate the principles and we have insight in it, without realizing it, we kind of make it smaller than it really is, to make the truths kind of smaller than it really is. So I know I do. I think I got it together, you know, like, oh yeah, I got my arms around these three principles. And there's a misunderstanding built right into that, where if I really appreciated just the vastness of, you know, the formless nature of truth, that idea would make me laugh sooner than it does sometimes. You know, sometimes I'm like, you want to know about this? You come to me. I think I got my arms around it. So that's another reason to talk about it, is because when we start to look towards, well, what are the principles pointing to? We get to appreciate more just how endless yet fundamental they really are. And in that way, we can see the difference between a lot of the other ideas that we come across, you know. So I've kind of been interested in that, and I'm endlessly interested in it, you know. So 7-8 years ago, people started asking, well, how's this different from mindfulness? No, I didn't know. I mean, I knew what the principles point to. I thought, oh, that's a good question. Let me wonder about that. And then as I started to appreciate the ways in which they were talking about the same thing, and then the ways in which they were diverged, it gave me more appreciation of just what the principles had to offer, and just how fundamental they are, and just how, you know, how endlessly informative they can be. So hopefully that's kind of why I thought we talk about this. So what I thought I'd do is kind of talk a little bit about it, but my main goal here is whatever understanding I do or don't have, whatever appreciation of things I do or don't have, I want to be available to you. I want it to be available to you. So I want to be a resource. So I want to have time for you to ask questions and to, you know, tell me a little bit where you're at. So I'm planning to leave time for that. So I wanted to start my discussion and my with my very first brush with the principles as an understanding, and that was when I was at university. And when I was at university, I loved what I did. I did anthropology, and I was very serious about it. And during the final exams, in the 6 to 8 weeks in the run up to the final exams, unbeknownst to me, I started to get very anxious about the exams. You know, I started to feel a lot of pressure. I started to feel a lot of insecurity, and I fed into that because I thought that was reasonable thinking because of how important these exams were, you know, and how, you know, you can do well for 3 years and totally ruin your exams. And, you know, that was scary to me. So I thought I should probably think about that, you know. So, you know, a week or two in, I was like clinically anxious, I'm pretty sure. So I didn't go to a psychologist deliberately because I thought maybe it will go away on its own. And if I get a diagnosis, maybe that'll make it harder to go away on its own. But I didn't know what was happening to me, other than I just was tormented almost every waking hour. And I wasn't sleeping, and I couldn't sit still, and my hair fell out, and I was calling home regularly. And my mum started to get very worried about me. So her younger brother is George Pransky. So she got George to call me. So she said, listen, I'm going to get George do you want some help? I was like, oh my God, do I want some help? Yes, please. I'm going to get George Pransky to call you. I'm going to get your uncle to call you and see if you, and I was like, thank you so much. When's he going to call? So we arranged it. And he called me. He says, Aaron, I hear you're struggling. I was like, oh my God. And then I just I laid it all out for him. And I was desperate to see, like, how could he help me? Because I was just really struggling. He says, well, Aaron, did you ever consider that that your thought might have something to do with it? And I thought, well, no. And no, it doesn't. This has nothing. Did I say thought when I told you did I say I'm struggling with? So I thought to myself, okay, fair enough for him to ask, but let me put him straight. So I basically told him it was nothing to do with thought. And I kind of gave him all the evidence for that. And I was like, okay, so what's plan B now? So he says, well, I know, but I mean, maybe it's something to do with what's happening in your mind. I was like, have we covered this already? I was not willing to consider the possibility that it had anything to do with thought. And the reason I bring that up was it was so outside of my understanding that a reality in which my thought was playing a part in what I was just inconceivable, utterly inconceivable. And what's interesting is all the symptoms were there that it was to do with thought, because one of the things that it was also in my understanding was the night before an exam, there's no point worrying. There's nothing you can do. The only thing you can do is give yourself mental space, and, whatever you have absorbed has more chance to come out. That was in my understanding. So at 5 o'clock every night before an exam, all my anxiety disappeared completely. I was in a very peaceful, clear state, slept like a baby, woke up the next day, felt very calm, very focused. The other thing that made sense to me was it doesn't make sense to listen to your anxiety in an exam. So, when you turn over the paper and you get that rush of adrenaline and you can't read properly, it made no sense for me to listen to that. It made no sense. It's just keep reading it until it makes sense. So I did that. So I didn't have anxiety problems during exams, the night before an exam. So everything that was in my understanding worked for me. And I was completely limited by what was outside of it. Right. So, and I never considered, what George had asked me was so ridiculous, I never gave it a second thought. Even after the exams, when the anxiety went away, it never dawned on me, never crossed my mind at all. Right. And because in my understanding, the mind was the mind. There was nothing to see there. It seemed like a waste of time. It was like, well, get on with using your mind. Why would you be thinking about your mind? It makes no sense to me. And for many years, mostly George, but George and Linda tried to get me interested in the principles, and I would visit them fairly regularly and spend time with them, and they would put me on trainings. But my understanding was that the things that they were talking about were ridiculous. So when I would sit in on the trainings, what I would hear was, this is ridiculous, that's ridiculous, this is ridiculous, that's ridiculous. So if you'd ask me, what do you think of what they're saying? I'd say, well, it's ridiculous. And if you then ask me, well, what did they say? I'd say, well, I don't know, I haven't a living clue. But I can tell you it was ridiculous. And because the role of my thought was invisible to me, there's nothing I could do about it. You say, are you sure it's ridiculous, Aaron? Oh, 100%. I didn't hear anything that wasn't ridiculous. Well, what did you hear? Well, I don't know. Well, what do you make of that? Well, I don't know. That would have been the utter end of it. So years later, George was writing a book, and he wanted, and I was on a trip with him, and you know, I was telling him about my degree and how in anthropology you compare different theories and stuff like that. And he said, well, look, Aaron, can I employ you to research the work that I'm doing and compare the work I'm doing to other psychologies? I said, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a dream come true to me. I wanted to be a researcher, and that would have been I would have experience. So I was really thrilled. And I said to him, well, look, you know, I can't take your word for it. I'm going to have to like see for myself. And he was like, oh, fantastic. Come to Velkommen. So I moved to Velkommen for a couple months. And during that time, I spent half of my time at the university libraries researching different psychological approaches, and then researching the principles and listening to tapes of Sid and George and reading articles and stuff like that. And then I spent the rest of my time sitting in on sessions and seeing the work that they did and all of that. Now, the first thing that was interesting to me was when I started researching the principles. Firstly, I put my this is nonsense thinking aside, because I'm being paid to learn about this. You're being paid to put your own opinions aside. Your job is to understand it, not judge it. Right? Now, that was the game changer. That was the game changer. And it's sad but true, but it was easy to do once I was being paid to do it. Because if that's what you're up to, anybody can listen to understand or read to understand if that's what they're trying to do, you know? So that's what I basically set myself to. And what was fascinating was every piece of information that I got about the principles when I was actually interested to understand was brand new, absolutely brand new. And it's interesting. I think it's really interesting how I'd been to like 6 or 7 trainings with Judy Sedgman, with George, with Linda, with Dickon, with Keith, with Sandy, with all of those people. And I literally hadn't heard a single thing. And I hadn't, everything I saw when I was interested was brand new. And even years later, that surprises me. That really surprises me. That you can be in a seminar, you know, judging how silly it all is and not know what it is that's silly, not know anything about what they said. And I find that absolutely fascinating. But anyway, I won't get carried away. So that was interesting. What was even more interesting was when I started to research the other psychologies, I looked into other psychological theories. They were all different. So I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. Every theory has a different understanding of the mind. Because I thought, well, the mind's the mind, isn't it? We must all just have the different theories, must be different ways of approaching the mind. But not so. Every different theory, like, you know, psychoanalytical, you know, existential, cognitive, behavioral, they all had completely different understandings of what was going on with the mind, how it led to people's problems, what you had to do about it. It was a completely different theory, right? And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. At the root of all these different approaches are completely different understandings of what the mind is, of what thought is, right? So it kind of got me a bit more open, because I realized, oh, I guess we don't really know what the mind is. I guess we don't really know what thought is. Like, if there are different theories of it, we must not really know, right? It must kind of be up for grabs. Like, if you can think of it this way and you can think of it that way, there must be no real discovery about that. the third thing that stood out to me was the principles that I was reading about, mind, consciousness, and thought, that Sydney Banks had been pointing to, that George was using in his work, was an absolute break in understanding from every single other theory, right? Every single other theory, even though they were different, right? So when I first read the other theories, I'm like, oh, behavioral's like this, and cognitive's like this, and humanistic is like this. They're all different. But when I really looked at what the principles were saying, it was like, wow, this is different. I mean, this is a departure. And compared to the principles, all the other theories look pretty similar. And that stood out to me. That really got my attention, how different the principles' understanding of the mind was from everything else, in a way that highlighted much more similarities between the other approaches. Like they were all one family, and this was like kind of like Neanderthals and whatever came after that. Homo sapiens. There you go. My biology didn't fail me completely. And what was interesting were the ways in which that was the case, right? So on the most subtle level, even that was profound, but on the most subtle level, all the theories I looked at all saw thought as having an effect. They all saw thought as involved in people's, how functional or dysfunctional people were, and in having some role in people's suffering. Right, there, thought was involved. Even behavioral saw thought as involved. It was like, well, the mind is creating these things, thoughts involved, but that's a black box to us, so we don't worry about that. It's not like they're saying it wasn't involved. They were just saying, well, we can't see what's going on there, so we're not going to think about it. But they definitely said it was involved. And the principles said that thought was involved, right? But what was interesting was there was a huge gap between the principles' understanding of thought and the other psychological understanding of thought, right? It was a huge gap, right? Firstly, and the most profound gap, was that from Sydney Banks's perspective and from George and his colleagues' perspective, thought was the only thing people were experiencing, the only thing, right? So if you listed the suspects in what's creating people's experience, there was only one, and it was thought. Always, and in every case, it was thought. Doesn't matter what it feels like, doesn't matter what's actually happening. So, if someone has a terminal illness, or they stubbed their toe, or they lost their sandwich, or they're facing financial ruin, whatever they're experiencing, you need look no further than thought. That was utterly unique, utterly unique. Every other approach had other factors involved, even cognitive. So the only thing cognitive therapy looks at is the effect that thought has on people. But if you look closely, they're interested in the accuracy of the thought. And how do you assess the accuracy of a thought? You compare it to reality. Now, in order to do that, you have to think you can experience something outside of thought. From a principles-based perspective, you can't compare thought to reality because you don't have any access to that, right? So when that dawned on me, I'm like, wow, that's a big difference, right? So from a principles perspective, cognitive therapy is ridiculous. It's like, well, how can you? There's no accuracy in thought, and even if there is, there's no comparing it to reality. You don't have a relationship to reality. I feel reality. Oh, you feel. Okay, well, that's thought too. Yeah, but I get cold. Well, that's thought too. No, but what really interested me was when I reflected on my own experience, that was true. I could see, wow, my experience of cold comes and goes, doesn't it? And I was one of these people that was paranoid of getting cold. So every autumn I would get cold before the temperature dropped, because I was trying to avoid being cold. So I'd turn up somewhere, everyone's in their summer jackets. I've got a woolen hat, a scarf, a big coat on, then they're like, cold? I'm like, no, not me. I'm actually not cold because I'm ready for cold. But it was on my mind all the time. And as a result, I was always having the experience of the cold, regardless of the temperature. So that was completely different. That the only thing that created your experience is thought. There was no other psychological theory that had that. Every psychological theory had other factors, like the past, in some cases, your DNA, your past experiences, your habits of behavior. And from the principles perspective, which interested me because it was so radically different, no, it's just thought. If you can feel it, it's thought, right? So that was one. And we'll come back to that, because how seriously you take that, what would I call it? That proposed idea. If you take the idea that the only thing you're experiencing thought, in my experience, how seriously you take that idea determines whether you learn it or not, right? So I've learned it, hopefully, loads of times, but I come into situations where that understanding falls away and I'm up against what it feels like, which is, oh my God, this situation is really bothering me. And if I go back to the idea, well, there is no situation, Aaron, in your life, it's only thought. And then I think, no, this is really serious. How seriously I take that idea, no, it has to be thought, determines whether I learn it again. If I learn it again, then I'm free again. And if I don't, I block off an area of my understanding where I'm then vulnerable to that misunderstanding that there's something other than thought. Now, what's really interesting is every other psychology had an open door to theories and the reality that there's something else other than thought involved. Every single other psychology, right? And if in my experience of the principles is, as soon as you consider that something you're experiencing comes in any way other than thought, you make it a bigger, more difficult thought to deal with, because you put it in a different category and you victimize yourself to whatever misunderstanding you create, right? And the beauty of the principles is, if you go back to the principles, you won't find that vulnerability. You won't find that gray area. There's no way to do that whatsoever, right? So I was working with a group last week and they kept doing that. Like we talked, like, yeah, so what I'm saying is everything you're experiencing is thought. Oh yeah, all right, okay, right, I got it. So then we start talking about people that piss us off, right? And I'm like, yeah, so as we were saying earlier, when you guys were nodding your little heads off, someone's really annoying you. That's the, oh, no, that can't be. What if this? What if that? And it was, I was like, are you like, you have amnesia from an hour and a half ago? Is that what's happening? But it's really difficult to consider that no matter what it feels like, it's just shifts in the shape of thought or the content of thought or the feeling of thought. It's really difficult, you know? So, and they would argue like, oh my God, you can't tell me that if that person starts talking to me about my football team and he's annoying me, that I could actually not be upset. And saying, well, if you're upset, I want you to consider that it can only be your thought. I can't believe that. But whether it's true or not, the ability to consider it allows you to discover whether it's true, right? So that person can't discover it's true by me getting in their face and saying, remember what we talked about half an hour ago? That's just not going to work. The only way it's going to work is if the person says, well, hold on a second. Let me think about that. What if it was thought? Oh, that's interesting. You know, actually there, and this is what one of them said, one of the people in the group said, you know, there are some days where that person doesn't even annoy me. That's interesting. Maybe that's what, so because it's true, as soon as you look, you'll see it, but only you can look for yourself. But the power of the understanding is it's so simple and uncompromised. It will always set you straight if you look in that direction. It's not like, well, usually it's this, but sometimes it's that, which, you know, and it's like, well, how do you know? But it's just really simple. Now, when I first realized what the principles were pointing to in this way, what I thought was, nah, it can't be. I mean, it's very simple and it's very uncomplicated. So it's a very easy theory to apply, but it's probably it can't be reduced to that. But I was interested. I was like, I wonder. So I thought, you know what? I'll just treat everything as if it's thought. And as soon as it's not, it won't behave like thought, right? So, you know, when you have a thought, once you realize it's a thought, it doesn't really affect you as much. And then it kind of goes in and out of your consciousness. You know what I mean? Goes in and out of your consciousness. So I thought, well, if I treat something like a thought, like I basically I'm willing to, you know, put it aside and let it come and go. Just that feeling, not technically, but that feeling of like, oh, okay, well, don't worry, leave it alone. It's okay, whatever. If it behaves like a thought, like it starts to come and go, I'll have discovered it was a thought. And if it doesn't, like it honest to goodness hangs around, whether I'm thinking it or not, whether I'm focused on it or not, then I'll have hit the limits of that theory and I'll have discovered something that's not a thought. But let me see, you know, 27 years later, I still haven't come across it. And in the last 22 years, it's not just me. I've had thousands of clients and it hasn't been that way in any other area. Like, and every now and then I'll have a client. I'm like, ooh, this will be interesting. I wonder. Like, oh, that was thought too, you know? So it's very different from anything else I've ever come across, that idea that you're only experiencing thought. But that was only half of it. The other thing that interested me was, if you looked at the other therapies and the other theories that were interested in thought, that considered thought a major problem or a major troublemaker in human functioning, they all had ways of trying to do something about it. You know, and in the sessions I was sitting in on, none of the counselors like Dickon or Keith or George, they didn't do anything about people. They were totally uninterested in doing anything about people's thoughts. So people say, oh, I got this thought. What shall I do with it? And they changed the subject. You're like, anyway. And I was like, that's interesting. And when I looked into it more, what I saw was there was a very specific idea about thought, that thought was neither good nor bad. Thought itself caused no problems. Thought caused experiences. Thought caused, you know, states of consciousness. Thought created our experience of life, of reality, of ourself in lots of different ways, right? In different levels of consciousness, right? But there was no sense that thought, any kind of thought, insecure thought, jealous thought, angry thought, delusional thought, there was no sense that the thought caused any problem. There was nothing problematic about thought. The only thing that made thought a problem was when we misunderstood it or we misused it. Right? So if someone was like highly anxious and completely dysfunctional, that was caused by thought, but the thought did not cause the problem. The problem was caused by the person's relationship to the thought. They were taking it too seriously or some such thing. So really what I got out of it is when people treat thought as if it's real, they have a problem because of that misunderstanding relationship to thought, right? So it would kind of be like when War of the Worlds was on the radio and people hadn't had radio dramas, so they ran out in the streets because they thought there was an alien invasion. It wasn't the radio problem, it was people's misinterpretation of it. So what I saw was, according to the principles, thought can't cause you a problem. It's completely incapable of leading you, of making a problem. Our misinterpretation of the thought causes chronic suffering, dysfunction, struggles, problems in life, problems in relationship. And that intrigued me because there wasn't a single other approach that thought that. Every other approach thought certain types of thought cause certain types of problem. And you can know for sure they thought that because their approach to those problems was to try and get rid of the thought, right? So they thought the thought creates the problem, and because there's a problem, you've got to get rid of the cause of the problem, which is the thought. The principles approach, no, the thought's not causing the problem. The misinterpretation of the thought's causing the problem. So they address that. Hey, let me help you understand what thought is, right? It was so utterly different. It really turned my head for quite a while. And then I realized all these other approaches, they thought thought was a thing. They thought it was a real thing. Like, you know, if I want to get rid of this chair, I got to get it out the room. I have to do something to move it because it has a life of its own, right? I just can't stop thinking the chair and expect it to go somewhere. But the way the principle saw thought was like, oh, it's not real. It feels real, but it's not a real thing. It doesn't have a life of its own. So there's nothing you need to do. You just need to realize it's not, doesn't have a life of its own. It's not a real thing. It's just energy in flow. There's nothing to be done other than to realize it's not as real as it seems. It's not a real view of reality. It's just you in that state of mind. And that was radically different. Like, wow, they don't see thought as the problem. They see misunderstanding as the problem. And they don't do anything about the thought. And what I saw when I sat in was that was true. That was true. That they weren't getting rid of thought. They weren't addressing thought, but people's level of well-being went shot through the roof, and the thoughts that they were having stayed the same. So people who were bogged down in depression didn't get rid of their depressed thoughts. They got rid of the idea that it was real or that it was anything they needed to worry about. And their level of well-being changed utterly. And they didn't care whether they had depressed thoughts anymore, or obsessive compulsive thoughts anymore, or anxious thoughts anymore, or hateful thoughts anymore, right? And that did wonders for me in my relationships, where it's like, oh, if I don't like you, that's just a thought. If I want to live in that thought, I can live in disliking you. But if I don't want to, it's not going to affect me. And it's not going to affect our relationship. And it's like, oh, my relationships are invulnerable if I want them to be. And it's that realization of the nature of thought as an illusory function, not as a real thing, that created in me huge confidence and well-being and lightness and just that recognition of invulnerability. Through that fact, I realized, wow, I'm invulnerable. The only thing I'm vulnerable to is how I feel and see things. And the only vulnerability I have there is I have to go through these different states of consciousness. But as long as I know their thought, there's literally nothing they can do to me. I'm completely invulnerable. So the need to worry about how I feel or what I think or how I'm doing or how am I doing now completely stopped making sense. And when I looked at the other approaches, what I saw is not only do they think that the thought is dangerous, which creates a validity for insecurity, right? you know. And if you listen to the way people talk about thought, they'll sometimes talk about it like it's a malevolent actor, like it's waiting around a dark corner for you, and it might have a hammer, or it might have a, you know, who knows what it might creep on. And people are scared of thought. Like when I talk to people, they're, yeah, what if there's a thought hiding in your subconscious, and it might be, you know, chipping away at your foundations? And I'm like, well, that would be fair if thought had a life of its own, but, you know, it doesn't have a life of its own. But they don't know that. And nor did these other psychologies. They saw thought as dangerous and real. So one of the things that I realized was when I was watching Tre Principles people's work, people were discovering that thought wasn't real and it was nothing to worry about. In all these other therapies, in the process of trying to help people, they were convincing them how real they were, feeding into the idea that thought was real. Oh, you got this thought. What are we going to do about it? We're going to try this and we're going to try that. And whether it was taught deliberately or not, one of the underlying understandings, the underlying assumptions is thought is dangerous, you're vulnerable, and it's real. God forbid you catch it. Like my daughter was when my daughter was 15, they did a health and well-being class. She came home, she said, you know, how's the health and well-being today? It was really bad. I said, well, what's so bad about it? She said, well, we watched a video on mental health. I was like, oh, what was in the video? She said, well, they told you that if you have a bad feeling and you have a chronic mental health experience, like you feel bad chronically, don't think it's not serious. That's like a really serious physical illness. That's not going to go away, you know. That's what they were. Right? And that's what these psychologies understand. But because they all have their own version of it, it never gets questioned. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't read about the principles. So one of the powerful facts of how different the principles is, whether you think it's right or not, it undermines the unquestioned assumption that thought is real, that thought is dangerous, that mental health problems are real. That's what it did for me. The principles were so different. It allowed me to question the agreed assumptions within all the other different psychologies, right? Now, the last thing that was different about the principles, which is the most profound and the most radical, is that the nature of the mind is well-being. And actually that the nature of the mind is spiritual, and particularly spiritual, meaning it's a fundamental essence and it's before the material world, meaning you cannot touch it physically, right? So I don't know, if you have an incredibly traumatic experience, that cannot touch the fact that the essence of the mind is perfect well-being and love and connection and now this might sound funny, but universal consciousness, universal intelligence, universal feelings, right? Now, there were a couple psychologies that grazed the edge of that, right? Like, so for example, Maslow, and he's not famous for this, but this is the most radical thing he proposed. If you look at people that are really happy and functional, they have a different kind of cognition. They have a different kind of cognition. And it's a cognition that comes naturally. And he described everything about the mind in flow, the emotions, the qualities. And he described how powerful it was. And he was really interested in that because he's like, I think people might be capable of mental health and self-actualization. We should look at this. But it was so out of the realm of psychology. What's he remembered for? Hierarchy of needs. You know, like, people say Maslow, I'm like, yeah. And they're like, hierarchy of needs. I'm like, oh my God, boring. But anyway, so that didn't exist in any other psychology. So much so that from the principles perspective, what stood out to me is mental health and richness of life and resilience are seen as effortless normals. You don't take anything to do it. Once you stop having an unhealthy relationship with your with I don't know, your thought, whether you're chronically analyzing or wallowing in anxiety, once that stops making sense to you, then you're going to naturally and unavoidably feel more of a purer mind, a purer thought, a purer consciousness. And that's what happened to me. I saw that anxiety was not a clear mind, so I lost faith in it and fell into a completely different consciousness, a completely different feeling, a completely different qualities of our internal. And I saw clients doing that. And not only was the idea that the essence, the unavoidable, inalienable essence of human beings is a deep, rich wealth of wisdom and well-being, that from their perspective, from the principles perspective, when it comes to your mental health, you can run, but you can't hide. From all the other psychological approaches, because of the way they saw thought and dysfunction and the way they approached it, mental health was not even in the discussion. It wasn't even on the table. You couldn't read anything about it. There wasn't a single sentence about mental health, clarity of mind, well-being, love. It was never even mentioned. And the assumption was so deep that as an adult, given the experiences and circumstances and thoughts that we all have, you can work hard to improve your lot, but it's not going to be a happy one. Was so different to what I was seeing in the principles, which is, yeah, you don't need to do any work. There's nothing really wrong with you, but thought can sure be tricky. It was radically different. And what was really interesting to me was whatever you believed, whatever you understood, you lived. You lived. So in the lives and the work of the principle-based practitioners, I was seeing exactly what they described. And in the people who thought had these other understandings, that's what you saw, right? And it really is the understanding that makes a difference. Like I do a practitioner program where people watch me do sessions with people, and I was doing a sessions with somebody, and we were having this discussion, and I was talking to them about how thought's not real and how underlying there's this well-being, and they started to lighten up, and then they went, hold on, I feel like every time I talk to you, I feel lighter and healthier. And then I go back to therapy and I feel more serious. And in this moment, I feel like I should take my anxious thoughts more seriously. Aren't I not doing them justice? And basically I said to them, look, what you got to realize is there's different understandings of that. Your therapist understands it like this is serious. If you don't deal with it, it's going to bog you down. From my understanding, whatever you think is going to bog you down. So you can see how I would say that would work. From my perspective, there's I think the way I would say it is, it's like, if you're not feeling good, your purity of mind is disturbed. So everything you're aware of is fruit of the poison tree. There's nothing for you there. So why would you worry about it? But they're two different understandings of the same thing. You have to decide which direction of understanding you want to go in, which I think is true. You can't take your upsetting thoughts seriously and then see how to not take them seriously. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. So, it was those three areas where there were differences between the principles and everything else. And really interestingly, they're the three areas that I'm always up against in my understanding. You know how I said, like, I'll have times where my consciousness will go down, and sometimes it will go down and then pop back up, but then sometimes it will go down and then it stays down, and I'm like, what's happening to me? And when I step, after I stopped trying to dig myself out, because it gets worse. And I consider it, and it's like, normally what occurs to me is either I'm not treating it like it's thought, it's out of my world, that I'm just experiencing thought. And as a result, I'm taking it really seriously, right? And trying to take something seriously that you think is more than thought is really difficult, really difficult. Trying to take something seriously that you know is made up, also really difficult, right? So, or secondly, I've forgotten that thought is made up. You know, thought is not reality. Thought is not anything other than what's being formulated in my mind to create an experience as if it's a reality. I've forgotten that. Or, and this is the utterly most profound part, nothing is real except the essence of life. And the essence of life is the same as the essence of mind. And it's perfect intelligence, perfect consciousness, perfect rich feelings. And or I've forgotten that. And what is wonderful about the principles and looking towards how it's different from other things is there's not very much to consider. You know, so someone asked me, they said, well, how is the principles different from mindfulness? I thought, well, that's interesting. How is it? It's like, well, it's the same in the sense that they're both pointing to the fact that you're experiencing your state of mind. We're both pointing to that. They both completely agree that your thinking corrupts your clarity of mind. They both really see a clearer mind as a more neutral, I don't know what you'd say, more enlightened state. They both see that as good for what ails you. However, mindfulness treats this, you know, the buildup of dysfunctional thought as a given that you have to kind of offload, whereas the principles looks at it as totally optional, and that the more you understand it, you stop producing it. So if you can understand it in a way that you stop producing it, why would you need to meditate to get rid of it? It doesn't make any sense. And secondly, there's a radical difference between using mindfulness to manage your clarity of mind and realizing that clarity of mind in a meditative state is an effortless default. That is worlds apart. I mean, that is just, you couldn't get further apart. But I didn't really realize that until I reflected on it. And then I learned it. I'm like, wow, that is so different. It is so different. To the principles points towards unlimited, effortless levels of consciousness through understanding. And mindfulness points to, you know, resetting yourself. Just so utterly different. The understanding is just so utterly different that don't even make sense. You can't fit them together. And everything's like that, you know, everything's like that. There'll be some understanding or recognition of the underlying truth of life, which I think the principles points to. And then there'll be some stuff that kind of points it away from that, you know, just like there is in our heads. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. And then now I want to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So, and it can be about what I've said. It can be about something, anything, completely anything. So the time is yours. We can talk about whatever you want. And I'd love to hear from you too, if there are things that are occurring to you that I'd love to hear what's kind of clear for you right now or on your mind.
Aaron, that was a joy. That was very clear.
Oh, good.
Yeah, lovely. And I'm certainly a different place listening to you today than I was 10 years ago. So I'm getting a lot out of it. So thanks. Well, everyone, please raise your digital hand if you have a question or a remark or an insight, anything you want to share. Mm-hmm. Or you can put up your physical hand and I'll do my best to see you.
But if you put up your physical hand, make sure your camera's on.
Yes. Good point. Tina, we've got one.
Hi. When you were talking, I just remembered I heard this saying lots of times, and I didn't really get the meaning of it before now. Yeah. And the saying is, oh, it's just something we are playing. And it's like, hey, they don't even know how true that is. It is just something we are playing. Yeah, that just came to me. Thank you.
So cool. I love it when that happens, when you know you kind of your mind kind of gets a chance to drift, and then it's something really resonate, like you really see it, you're like, oh, wow, that's true. You're like, you have a realization. That's very cool. That's very cool. Yeah, we just playing. And isn't it funny how in certain states of consciousness, those things really come alive. And then as we get more wrapped up and agitated, you know, it's like, yeah, whatever, what? Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing. That's great. I'm just playing. That's cool.
Anyone else? Linda's writing, what a fantastic talk from you. I'm so enlightened. You were so clear. I've never heard so good explanations on the differences. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gunmayan from Norway.
Hi, yeah. Nice to see you. Hello. So nice to see you.
Long time.
I know. Can't even think.
Yeah. Once when I talk with a lady who come to me, and we talk about problems she had, but she said, when I said, this is taught, like you said now, this is taught, that too, and so on. And she said, but what about when we dream during the nighttime? We are sleeping. I'm not thinking. Oh, I said, and she got mad.
That's great.
What will you say about that?
What would I say about that?
Yeah.
Well, it's really funny, Gunmarin, because I think dreams are the perfect illustration that it's thought, right? And I'll come to what your client said, because what I think we're talking about is that understanding simplifies and frees, and misunderstanding gets in the way, right? Misunderstanding gets in the way. But what's really interesting is you never know what the misunderstanding is going to be. It's not like, oh, there's 5 key misunderstandings and I'm going to just see which one. Because thought is infinite, there's infinite misunderstandings. So you really have to listen to people to pick up, oh, what's the misunderstanding, right? So what your client said is, that's not thought because I'm not thinking, right? So then that points to, oh, the client thinks that thought is just you thinking. So if thought's like an iceberg, they only see the bit at the top, right? And it's like, oh, well, did you know that thought is the way our experience is created? You don't wake up and think your experience, like, and then if you lose concentration, you're like, boo. It doesn't happen. It's not personal. Thought is not personal. Thought, like our thinking is like a tiniest bit of thought. And if you had the idea that, oh, if I'm not thinking, there's no thought, then you don't understand. You just don't. And that happened to me. Like the first day I had anxiety and I couldn't see any thought, freaked me out. So I got up, I'm a bit anxious. I'm like, yeah, it's just thought, isn't it? I look in my head, nothing there. I'm like, oh man, maybe this is a different kind of anxiety. Maybe it's a real one, like that comes from other things and thought. And then that wisdom popped in and was like, yeah, just because you can't see the thought doesn't mean there isn't one. No smoke without fire, right? Now, just imagine someone said to you, no smoke without fire, and you thought it meant if you can't see a fire, there's no smoke. So you go to your house and you smell burning and you're like, oh, there must be a fire. Well, I don't see a fire, so maybe this is a different kind of smoke. You just go for a nap. But the client doesn't understand. No, thought's not you thinking. That's part of it. But you feel cold. That's a thought. You have a feeling. That's a thought. Right? Now, if you're dreaming, how are you going to explain that without thought? So I'm lying in bed, my eyes are closed, and I'm late for my exam, and I'm naked, and someone drops by in a flying car. And how am I going to explain that? How can you explain? The only thing that's happening is thought. There's nothing else happening. And then I feel like I'm falling. But I'm not falling. I'm just lying in my bed. I'm like lying still. I'm just twitching my little feet. Oh, he's dreaming that he's running. So it's like dreams is perfect because our experience of physical reality when we're dreaming is exactly the same as when we're awake. Exactly. So much so that if you have a ridiculous dream, you still think it's real because it feels real the same way. So to me, what dreams isolates the outside and shows you, yeah, your mind is creating that. Your mind is creating that reality. And dreams shows you that your mind's creating. And the beauty of it, it shows you, yes, it is thought. Yes, it is your thought, but you're not like deliberately doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
It's so interesting the way that you said that personal thinking is like a tiny little bit of thought. And that's, to me, through the years that I've been deepening my understanding, that's the bit that people get confused about. They think that personal thinking and thought are the same thing.
Yeah.
That's the confusion. It's just part of thought, the principle of thought, the spiritual power of thought.
Yeah, that's true.
That's where they get caught up. Anyway, there's Susanna is writing. She's right.
Yes,
Could you mention an example of physical illness / health as being a thought? Thank you.
Okay, so before I talk about this is something that the way I think about this. Let me go back to this. Suzanne, thank you for asking. The way I think about this is I start with the principles and then I like to see what effect it has. To me, it's everything we're doing is learning. It's a big learning. It's a big experiment. It's a big discovery, right? So one of the things that and so the truth is, I don't know everything about what you just asked, Suzanne. I don't. But here's what I have observed, discovered, understood, rightly or wrongly. I was operating under the premise that our experience is arrived at through thought. And this is just the way I think about it, okay? So don't take it too literally. But as our clarity of thought varies, our quality of experience, our perception, and our whole experience of things varies, okay? So, I mean, just think about me and my exams. I was so stressed I couldn't sit still. And then the night before the exam, I've got the same exams, but yet I'm very peaceful and very content, right? That shows you a very disturbed thought version of experiencing my exams and a very clear-minded, peaceful thought-based experience of my exams, right? Now, I operated on the assumption that because our thought is the basis, is the root of our experience of everything, our experience of everything can be vastly different because thought is formless. It can be vastly different, right? So when I have had when I have had clients or myself or my family with serious illness. Did you say serious illness or did you say illness? Physical illness. Okay. I was operating under the premise that your state of mind, your clarity of mind, your relationship to your thought, whether it's disturbed thought or clearer thought, will determine your experience of illness health. That was basically my premise. And what I discovered was, not only is that true, so as people's mind becomes more agitated and disturbed, their experience of illness and health and everything else gets worse. And as their mind is less, as they're less burdened and preoccupied with their disturbed thought, people's experience of health and illness changes radically. So I'll give you an example, and then you can ask me a follow-up question. I'll give you two examples. So, oh yeah. So I'll tell this quickly, but I had a client who was actually, I was kind of part of my extended family, but I was asked to see them as a client. And they had a terminal illness, like they had a terminal cancer that was inoperable, and they were at home essentially waiting to die and suffering greatly. And they came to see me, and they were talking and I sat down with them, and I was thinking, well, how am I going to help them? Like, how am I going to help them? Like, they're dying. I'm not going to be able to do anything about that. Not like I'm going to cure their cancer. So what am I even supposed to do here? But then I thought, well, my job is to basically not get wrapped up in my own thinking, to have an open mind, and the universal intelligence of mind will tell me what to do. I don't know what to do, but luckily that's not my job. So I was sitting there and I was listening, and I heard worry. I heard anxiety. Oh, I'm going to die and I don't know what's going to happen. I heard anxiety, and it occurred to me, oh, yeah, anxiety, right? And as I listened more, I heard anxiety based on a fear of the unknown, right? So I said to the person, I said, well, it sounds like you're worried about dying, because that's what I heard. So they said, well, yeah, I'm worried about dying. I don't know what's going to happen, and blah, blah, blah. And as I'm listening, it's popped in my mind, well, nobody knows. And I was like, well, I don't think anybody knows. As far as I know, nobody's lived to tell the tale. So the person stopped. They were like, they saw the ridiculousness of their own thinking for themselves. They saw it. They're like, oh, I'm worrying about something I can't know. I'm worrying about something I'll never know. I was like, well, that's what I was wondering. And as soon as they saw it, all of their anxiety as thought became irrelevant. And you just see the well-being come out. They were just, oh, they looked really happy. And it was such interesting for me. I was like, wow, you look really happy. Like, you look really perturbed, understandably in my mind, but now you look really happy. And it really shocked me, the difference of her experience. Now, this answers your question, Suzanne, because when I asked her what she wanted at the beginning of the session, like, what do you want? What would you like to have happen? She said, well, I would like to enjoy the rest of my life and enjoy spending time with my family. And I said to them, well, why don't you do that? And they said, well, to be honest, the illness makes it impossible. I have no energy, and I'm plagued by migraine headaches and nausea. So I spend most of my time locked up in a room. I don't feel like seeing anybody, right? Now, bear in mind, she's got the same illness that's progressing day by day, in the coming weeks, she spent most of her time with her family really happily. Like I went a couple of weeks later, I went to visit them, and they were sitting in a room full of their family. Whereas when they were anxious about the illness, they couldn't bear to see anyone because of the physical symptoms. They were sick. And I said, well, how's it going? They said, well, I'm really happy and I'm loving spending time with my family. Occasionally I get too nauseous or my headache gets too bad and I have to go to bed for an hour or two or half an hour. Now, what really stood out to me was her experience of her physical illness was night and day. When she was in a bad state of mind or in a negative place, the illness was overwhelming and she couldn't enjoy herself and she couldn't spend. When her mind was free, she was just as ill physically. I mean, you know, she died of the illness, but she was happy. She was in content. She liked being around her family. She enjoyed herself. She was in a light, open room. And it just shows you how a shift in your level of, I would call it clarity or consciousness, state of mind, can change the experience of physical symptoms. And there was a radio program that was on many years ago, but it was basically looking at the relationship between what was it? Pain and suffering. The relationship between pain and suffering. And basically in this hospital ward, they'd realized that people all with the same disease, some were overwhelmed with the suffering of it, and some people were very happy, but just had some physical discomfort. And the difference was people who saw a spiritual reality and people who didn't. That was the only difference, which determines the seriousness that you take things with, right? So I don't know what's possible in terms of our ability to have different experience of illnesses, and also the way in which that might affect the actual illness itself. I think they're all tied in together. I don't know what the relationship is, but I know they're related, and I know there's a potential beyond that we're aware of. And just as a oh, nice, thank you, Louise. Just as a final, like, very working day example, when we have flu in our house, my daughter suffers greatly. She can't bear more than 10 seconds of it. My son doesn't suffer at all. He just lies his body like this. I'm like, are you all right? Yeah. Are you feeling okay? No, I'm ill. What kind of ill? Nauseous. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. She just doesn't think about it. He's just totally fine. He's just really nauseous and he's got no energy. Whereas my daughter's like, I can't stand it. I think that's the whole man flu thing. You know? Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, Suzanne, but that's kind of what I'm aware of about it. And it's just something that's well worth exploring. And sometimes people will say to me, well, if I have more well-being or more clarity of mind, or how will that change my illness? And the answer is, I don't know, but I know it will. I know there'll be some change in your experience of it. And there might even be some change in it. We just don't know. We really don't know. It's all to be discovered.
There's one who, Yrsa Jensen, just writes, feelings equal thoughts, right?
The way I think about it is feelings is part of our experience of thought. Right? So if you run energy through a light bulb, or you run electricity through a light bulb, it shows up as heat and light. If you run the spiritual intelligence of mind in the form of thought through a human being, you get an experience of life. And that has emotions, and that has perceptions, and that has physical sensations. But it has all of it. It's all experience of thought. But the unique part about feelings is the lifeline to an objective reality. You know how I said cognitive therapy says you can see an objective reality? well, feelings are an objective reality. You're literally feeling your purity and clarity of consciousness. You're literally feeling that. It's not like thought creates a feeling. The feeling is the experience of the purity of mind in whatever thought you're having. It's absolutely objective if you know how to read it. So if you feel deeply connected and that tells you that you're in a purity and clarity of mind, that's what you're feeling. And that means that your perception is of that order. It's going to be more insightful. It's going to be more connected to what's actually real than what gets made up in thought. I mean, it's still somewhat made up, but. And then as you start to feel more agitated, that's literally a millimeter by millimeter accurate experience of how disturbed and distorted your thought is. And as a result, how disturbed and distorted your perception is, your outlook is, your view of things is. That's invaluable. Because when we get crazy, don't look crazy to us. Try telling someone that's totally crazy they're crazy. Then you'll see whether they think they're crazy, right? So we live in the illusion of the reality of thought, but there's a complete experience of objectivity, and that's what your feeling's telling you. It's utterly amazing. I mean, it's literally amazing. You can, and it's so, like if you feel slightly uneasy, your mind is that much distorted. Your perception is that much blown out of proportion. Your view of things is that much dysfunctional and non-useful. It's complete. And that's the important part about feelings, is that we literally feel how disturbed and distorted our reality is, our mind is. And if you're willing to consider that, it's an absolute lifesaver. I'll just tell you one quick story because I think it's hilarious, but sad. I was at dinner with some entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneur next to me, who I actually had met before, said to me, well, Aaron, do you ever get burnt out and fed up with your job? And I was like, oh, yeah, I do. Like every 18 months, I get totally fed up and burnt out. Not regularly, but, you know, once every year, 2 years, I get utterly fed up. And I'm like, I hate my job. I hate the fact that I have to help people. And why do I always have to help people? Why can't someone else do it? And I'm fed up with it. So the entrepreneur says, well, what do you do? And I was like, well, I don't do anything. I know I'm full of it. If I feel really bad, my outlook's completely suspect. I wouldn't do anything. That would be like putting on sleep goggles, you know, those sleep masks, and going out for a drive. I wouldn't do that. I mean, this is ridiculous. I basically realize I'm full of it, and my sense of things is completely disturbed and unreliable. And then I come out of that state at some point, and I love my job again, and I get on with it. So there's this silence, and the person says, oh my God, I wish I'd met you 2 months ago. I was like, why? They're like, I just sold my business off the back of that. Right? Now, that's not unusual. That's when people leave relationships. That's when they leave jobs. It's when they move house. It's when they make major decisions, because the feeling's so compelling. They're misreading the feeling. They're treating the feeling from a subjective point of view, not an objective point of view. What is the feeling telling you? Like sometimes Leela tries to help me when I'm a maniac, right? So she's like, oh, you seem a bit stressed. I'm like, no, I'm not stressed. I just got a lot to do. She's like, no, but you seem a bit edgy. I'm like, listen, you don't understand. There's some of these things are important and right? So then sometimes she'll say, well, listen, Aaron, all I know is when people feel the way you're feeling, they're not really thinking in a very useful way. And then I'm like, oh yeah, there's no denying that. And there's no denying what I'm feeling. And then I'm saying again, not because I feel better, but because I'm calibrating to the right information, not miscalibrating to the wrong information.
It's great to have spouses who can sometimes, you know, tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, buddy, wake up.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
Wow.
Well,
All right. Do you want to?
No. No, I wasn't. Sorry.
No. This has just been great. I was just reminded a few minutes ago, something you said that a few years ago when Sydney Banks, he would say, you must go beyond your five senses. And that hit me like a ton of bricks about 4 years ago. Because our senses keeps telling us it's true. So if I keep, going to my body and my feelings and my, perceptions and say everything I perceive is true, then I won't see it. I must go beyond my five senses. And when I saw that, that was huge for me.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that was what he meant.
Yeah. Say that again.
Well, it was just that was what he meant. That if you stay in your five senses, reality, that seems real.
Yeah, totally.
That's what they do.
Yeah, so true. And that hit me when you said it, Natasha. It's like our five senses creates information about the outside world. So what hit me when you said that is, you're looking to appreciate a feeling for the inside world. So you can go deeper in the inside world. Like you can go deeper in your sense of the inside world, the world of feeling and sensation that's not connected to the outside world, doesn't pretend to be connected to the outside world. I'd never seen that before. That was really cool. Very cool. Yeah,
it's and I think right now with what's going on in our world, and people, but look, this is happening. They're staying on television. We should be frightened.
Yes.
If we listen to all that, that's gonna tell us, it's true.
Yeah, totally.
So
totally.
If we don't look within, it's we're gonna be.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I like that. That's cool.
Oh, this has been wonderful, Aaron. Thank you.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Thank you guys for turning up and listening and sharing.
Yeah. Well, so I hope all of you know that you can check out Aaron on his website. He's got a ton of YouTubes. And also, I know many of you already come to London to the conference, and it's always fun to be there. So I'm sure that we'll see each other.
Well, I also have an online course.
Oh, yeah, you do. Please share something about that.
Well, basically, I wanted to create a resource for people to start from scratch and get all the understanding, not the depth of understanding they need, but to get a full picture of it. So we spent 2 years making an online course that has 9 core lessons and lots of supporting videos. There's over 70 videos. It's just an online resource that we wanted to be affordable. You can get the first few videos for free. The whole thing's £85 for a whole year's access. And if you're interested, you can take a look. But the other idea of it is that you can refer people to it. The idea is we tried to make it so it built the understanding in a way that didn't make people feel there was anything weird about it. I know that sounds strange, but yeah. So we want people to know it's there in case they're interested.
Great. And so we just go to onethought.com.
Yeah, you can go to onethoughtonline.com.
Okay.
But if you go to the resources page, there's a link to it, but it's on onethoughtonline.com.
Great. I'll put it when we'll put on this video on the YouTube channel and on our Facebook group, and I'll write it in the.
Thank you.
I'll put the link in for you.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Love to Leela.
Yeah, I will tell her.
I'll see you in June.
Yeah, I'll see you in June.
And on Monday, but that's.